Hi guys, my name is Wednesday from Martian Radio Theater. Martian Radio Theater is a loose network of artists based in the greater Lowell area. We experiment with various forms of digital media and events including live theater and community workshops. As you may have noticed if you've been listening to this podcast, sometimes there are different hosts because this is a community podcast in which we sometimes pass it down the line so that we can interview as many folks in the theater community as possible, exploring all the nooks and crannies that there are. Today's episode features EJ and Betsy. EJ is a deaf actor accompanied by an interpreter named Julia, whose voice you'll be hearing during the podcast. Today's episode will be exploring theater in relation to the deaf community, including both the joys and challenges regarding access within the theater arts. So I would love for you guys to introduce yourselves a little bit. Would you mind starting, Betsy?
Sure. Hi, I'm Betsy. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I'm a director, educator, dramaturg. That's about it. That's me. I'm Betsy. Hi.
And hi, my name is Elbert Joseph, but I go by EJ. And my pronouns are he, they, them. And I wear many hats. I'm an actor. I'm a director. I'm a director of artistic sign language. I am also a theater interpreter. I do so many different things, but I'm so happy to be here tonight. And my interpreter here, as he said, is Julia. As Wendy has said, is Julia, and she'll be interpreting tonight, and you'll be hearing her voice. So there's many people involved. But of course, you know, for the people who don't understand sign language, that's why we're here, to provide communication access. So I'm thankful to everyone here, and thank you for inviting us Wednesday.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure. So I want to start off by getting to know you guys a little bit and your journey into theater. EJ, would you mind starting off telling us how you started your theater journey and started getting it to wear all these different hats?
Wow. Oof, what a question to start off. Well, I started off at the Horace Mann School for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. And so every year we would go to Wheelock Family Theater to see those productions that they had there. And we saw a number of different productions, so I really grew up going to theater all the time until there was one show that really made an impact on me, Peter Pan. And when I saw that show, I knew I wanted to act. I just knew it was in my soul to act. So once the show was done and we went back to school, the teacher had said, I want you guys to pick one actor from Peter Pan. Because, you know, back then there was no internet. So we used just regular paper and pen to communicate. And so I had to take some time to think about what character I would want to be. And so there was so the Smee really connected to me. So I decided to pick that person. And so, again, using that communication to write back and forth. And I thought Smee was a man, but actually, Smee is a female actor. And also, the casting director and in Wheelock Family Theater and Jane Stab. So I was able to communicate with them, and I said how much I really wanted to act. And so I couldn't be cast in Peter Pan because the show was still running. So I said, okay, you know, I really, really wanted to act. And so they said, let me know when you want to see the show, and then we can meet. And I was like, okay. So then my school went to go see Tuck Everlasting. And so I told Jane, hey, I'm going to go see that show. And she was like, all right, let's meet after that show to talk more. So once the show was done, I came up to talk to Jane. And she was still in costume. I really didn't know who she was outside of costume, but only in costume. And she said, oh, we're finally meeting in person. I was like, yep. And I was just like, and she just asked me, do you really want to act? And I was like, yeah. And she was like, why don't you come audition for The Wizard of Oz? And I was like, okay, yeah, sure. And so I waited and waited until the opportunity came up in November. I think that's November when I went to go do the audition. And I had no idea about theater at that time. I had little to no training in theater. I really had no concept of what an audition was about. And so I went in at that time with that frame of mind. I was only like 12 years old, but I was very eager to get the opportunity. And so there was a group of people there, and there was no interpreter in the room during that audition. So people, kept asking me to do things, and I just, I was kind of lost. So I just kind of copied what other people were doing and just followed whatever's going on. And then there was a woman who came up to me and asked me to do several things, and I didn't even know who she was. That's when I realized that was Jane Stab. So she asked me to do a number of things, but again, with no interpreter, I had no idea what she was saying. So then I went ahead with the audition, and after it was over, I, came closer and closer to casting time. And then I think the end of December, I got a call, and my mom, of course, answered the phone, and Jane said, oh, can I talk with EJ? And my mom was like, who's this? And I told my mom that was Jane from Wheelock Family Theater. And so my mom called me to come down. And so Jane was saying, oh, did you like the audition? And I told her I did. And she was asking if I had a good time. I said yes. And she asked me when my birthday was, and I said it's January 4th. And she was like, your birthday's January 4th, just like mine. And I was like, no way, we can't possibly. And she's like, guess what? You are in The Wizard of Oz, EJ. And I was like, what? So I was just like, will I get to play the monkey? And she's like, no, you're going to play a munchkin. You're going to have so much fun with this role, playing a munchkin. And so I was like, okay. And that was my first acting role that I got at a professional theater company at Wheelock Family Theater. And then I've just been, the rest has been history for me. But yeah, as I've said, it's been ingrained in me since I was little to be on stage. And that love of theater has always been there for the rest of my life till now.
Oh, that's fantastic. Wow. And I love that you brought Tuck Everlasting, because I'm currently reading it to my partner. So it's a little bit of a soft spot for me. But anyways, Betsy, would you mind telling us a little bit about your initial steps into the theater world?
Yeah, sure. They're not as like storied as EJ's, but I grew up going to an arts camp at Tufts, and it was like, an hour of visual art, an hour of drama, an hour of dance, and it was super, super casual. I basically talk about it as though it was hippie camp disguised as theater camp. And so as you moved up through the ages of that camp, when you started to be like middle school, 11, 12, you could audition to get into the higher level of drama there, where they actually put on like a full play. That was the whole camp. So I sort of fell into it that way by enjoying the process, of like a 6-week kind of intensive of getting to explore a character and being with my friends and having the space and time to explore who I was as a human, as well as what was going on in the world of the play. Mm-hmm. And most of my schooling, especially around theater, really sort of had that same bent, which was community building through theater and exploring politics and social issues and the ways in which we can become connected as humanity through theater, which when I got to college on an acting scholarship was like popped, because I didn't realize that outside of that scope, theater could be really competitive and not about what it means to create art as a group of people. So freshman year of college, I sort of shifted my focus from performing acting to using theater to teach and using theater for social change. I started like rocking with Augusto Boal, Theater of the Oppressed stuff and directing. And since then, it's just sort of been that. It's been directing, it's been teaching, it's been schooling to learn how to do those things better. And every once in a while I perform, but it's very rare. Mostly I'm directing or dramaturging, and I teach theater at a little private school in JP.
Wonderful. Thank you. And yeah, that's definitely one of the things that I struggle to reconcile sometimes is the sense of theater as a way for community building and then seeing it as industry, and that it kind of veers away from that, right? Once you get like a lot of money behind it, the competition's introduced. Would you mind delving a little bit into Theater of the Oppressed? It's a genre that I've heard of a few times in passing conversation recently, and would like to explore that a little bit more, if you don't mind.
Yeah, super quick rundown. Theater of the Oppressed is a series of games and exercises that sort of amount to a methodology through which folks play and practice self-advocacy and working together to address and ideally overcome one's own or not one's own oppression. It was started in the 60s in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, when there was a military coup, and theater was being censored and folks were being censored. And so it was this kind of agitprop underground attempt at utilizing the skills that one learns from theater to explore and strengthen the power that we have as humans and especially collectively. And it's gone through lots of iterations and journeys since then. But that's how I think about it at the core. And there are like full performances that you can do where folks from the audience get to come and take on the role of a protagonist and actually in the moment attempt to address something, which is not only important for like going through the motions and practicing what it is to have conflict, but also is a really cool, innovative theatrical practice by sort of blending audience and performers. So not only is Theater of the Oppressed, can it be used for specific socio-political issues, but it can be used in rehearsals, as theater exercises and games.
Oh, that's fantastic. I did not realize that it was a kind of methodology, more so than, a set of themes, right? Like I imagine Theater of the Absurd being. And this idea of using theater as a workshop space to cultivate resistance or be able to confront these dominant narratives, perhaps. Okay, I'm going to have to look much more into that because that's really stimulating. I think it segues nicely into my next question, which is, what are your thoughts on the current state of access for and representation of deaf people in relation to being depicted in theater? and being able to produce theater, right? In a culture that centers able-bodied people. And I think I'll pass this off to EJ first.
Okay. Wow. Whew. So Betsy and I have discussed this a lot for years and years and years. I mean, honestly, it's something we discuss almost every day. And Betsy and I have known each other for a long time. I knew her when she was back in high school. Even though we didn't go to the same high school, but we knew each other while we were both in those high school years until, today. And then we both got involved with American Repertory Theater, ART. And she happened to be an intern there. And so at that time, I needed signed access at a rehearsal. And Betsy just so happened to be there, and we met each other, and we were like, oh my God, we know each other. And so, the friendship was made, and then we met again and again, and our relationship was already established since that time. And again, so I just wanted to let you know the depth of our relationship. So to answer your question, so there's been many years where I've seen in Boston that access has made some improvements, but not great improvements. And I believe it should be much farther than it is now. It should have made much more improvements because we've already, we've made it through COVID and everything to get to this point, right? To have this sort of discussion. So to talk about access, to talk about the readiness for reopening. And of course, it's never going to fully go back to normal, but reopening for, to be more welcoming and more inclusive to different communities and to be more aware and raise that awareness. So to get rid of that marginalization that happens in communities, to have more voices in the room. But unfortunately, where it stands now, it feels like we're taking steps backward to, where we are. It feels like the 1980s all over again. And, in terms of representation, if I could compare it to something.
Please.
So thinking of back in the day, representation of deaf people was really minimal. It was more so deaf white people who were seen. But now, we'll see people of color pop up here and there, very, 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 even more minimally. But it should be much more representation now. We should see more Black deaf people being represented to match that of the white deaf community. Maybe even more than that, not nearly as minimal as it is now. So in Boston, what can I say? It's just, very sparse in terms of representation. Where are the Black deaf actors? It's really, right now, I'm pointing to just me. There are definitely others, but most of them are white females. And, in terms of getting continual work, I work very hard and, I really care. And I try to break through those barriers that are here, all of that oppression that happens. And I try to give opportunities to the other deaf people and deaf and disabled community as a whole. So, yeah, yep. Betsy, you want to take more of that?
I guess the only thing I would add, and it's an observation, and I want to be pointed in saying that it's just my observation, and I'm not really in the Boston theater scene in the way that some other folks are, and in the way that EJ is. I'm definitely more peripheral. But my observation and experience has been that, especially over the summer during the 2020, when the George Floyd incident happened, and there was this huge insurgence of theaters and folks in general finally, or at least vocally, understanding that they had a lot of work to do in terms of inclusion and diversity and representation. And what I found confusing was that, and I had people say to me, we're going to focus on race first, and then we'll get to the disability stuff. And to me, this was the most confounding thing, that in fact, to have that realization, that moment where you say, I've been doing this wrong. I've been, engaging in a racist system. I've been engaging in a system that consistently oppresses and silences people. And yet I'm only going to focus on one part of the intersectionality that exists in many, many folks. And these were people in Boston, that it started to feel to me like people really felt like they had to pick and choose, and that disability and access were somehow not as important as ethnic and racial diversity. And so for me, it's not just about access and representation. It's about the fact that it's all connected, and they seem to be trying to disconnect it.
Yeah.
I don't really know if that answers the question, but that's where I am.
No, I think that really speaks to...
Oh, and actually, if
Yes.
I could also add, so Betsy and I have had several meetings, and we always tend to go to them together because, two heads are better than one, right? So when we go to these meetings and we have these, really important discussions, somebody will say something and Betsy and I will be like, wait, what? Come again? Like, really? Again, and we hear that over and over again, like race first and then disability. Well, we'll focus on disability later. We'll get to it eventually, but first, like, race. And there's just not as much enthusiasm behind the disability discussion. And then it becomes bottom of the list, right? And it's almost like they hope that I would forget about it, or hope that EJ's too tired to talk about disability. But no, you can't separate me in that way, right? You can't separate those two parts of my identities, right? So how it's okay for maybe some able-bodied people to make that separation, but for me, it's just not a choice in that way. Like, why would that seem like to be a choice? And I'm just puzzled as to how they could even see those as two separate things. Of course, race is important, and I definitely believe in the race discussion, 100%. And really, that's only like the tip of the iceberg, really. And to devalue the disability discussion, that's promoting ableism, right? Ableism has a number of effects on race as well. And ableism, there's many isms that are just overlapping each other, and it influences a lot of things. So, like, for example, and, hats off, like Front Porch Theater, right? They're doing their best to support Black people, which is great. But where do I, as a Black deaf person, fit in? And I've heard, oh, wait, you're deaf. Oh, but they don't see me as a Black deaf person, a Black deaf man. and who's also happens to be gay. But the point is they, again, try to make that separation. Why is that okay for them to say, okay, we'll accept that you're gay, we'll accept this, we'll like accept these identities. But when it comes to disability, they're like, it's crickets. Like, oh, yeah, we'll talk about that part later. It's still a form of marginalization and oppression. You know, and it's because of that lens of whiteness, that oppression, that they can't see all those pieces.
I'm so glad you guys are emphasizing this idea of intersectionality and that these things are woven together, because it does seem like a pitfall we see constantly, this desire to compartmentalize everything and solve one thing at a time, right? And it feels so odd to create a hierarchy of oppression.
Yeah, it doesn't work. That it just doesn't work that way. And I think that's the problem with EDI. You know, the equity, diversity, and inclusion lens. Most people, you know, they will have that in their theater, that concept, and people get thrilled when they see that. But the problem with it is the inclusion part. They don't understand what that truly means to be inclusive. They just simply don't get it because they don't go out to meet deaf people. They don't interact with people in the disabled community and listen to their stories and hear what their needs are and what accommodations they might need, or what the theater can be doing and should be doing to be accommodating and inclusive, and where they can do better. You know, so that way they can be ready to welcome those people in. They just don't get it as well. And also celebrate disability. But oftentimes, I'll ask a theater community, how are they truly celebrating that disabled community? What is the definition of the theater community and when they're making those celebrations? So that's another conversation.
I also think that I was going to say an excuse that we hear, but a response that we often hear when EJ donates their time to say, here are the things that need to be in place in order for just me to have full access, let alone, you know, other folks who have different access needs, is basically like, well, we didn't plan for this money. We don't have this in our budget. And so we're going to have to do a lot of work, which is another way of postponing it. And so the question of funding and money and where you get your money and where you allocate your money. Yes, my cat is stretching. Sorry. Saw a little paw come out there. That access does cost money and it takes planning. And I think there's a way in which theaters have been operating like machines for a really long time. And, you know, I personally would sort of like to break apart the machine and rebuild it, but we're not even asking for that. You know, we're asking for like a separate machine that you attach onto it or something. And so the money issue is another thing that often comes up in terms of accessibility in particular.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of these conversations that prioritize different, identities, as we were talking about, are happening in institutional spaces. It kind of reminds me of a lot of, focus groups or listening sessions where folks are expected to contribute these things, right? And then you kind of are left with like an I hear you. And I don't know, I usually find that very frustrating because it can oftentimes stop there.
Yeah, exactly. It's an ongoing conversation. And for me, it feels like gaslighting, right? Like, oh, yeah, we hear your concerns, but it's like, where's the follow-up? What are you going to do about it? You can't just leave me like this. I mean, if you hear me, then do something about it. And I expect to see the end result and to see some follow through. Don't make me feel as though, I have all these ideas and I'm just supposed to sit there. It's a negative feeling, and it becomes unhealthy after a while to just let that all stew. And what they don't realize is that it influences it. And even though we shouldn't be taking on all these things personally, but it does. It affects us personally on a deeper level. And when we try to give that problem to them, they're just trying to look for a solution. But really, you have to dig deeper. But we haven't seen anything. They just give us the good enough result, the good enough solution. Nothing that's really, effective to show that they're valuing each of those communities and that they want to be celebrating those communities. And also oftentimes what'll happen is people will be, filling out the paperwork. And when they're doing the budget and making the budget, they forget to make access part of it from the beginning. Mm-hmm. They'll be like, later on they'll be like, we don't have it in the budget. But like, why didn't you include money for the access to begin with? Because, you should make access your number one priority and then make room for everything else, not the other way around.
And EJ, did you say, or maybe it was Betsy who said that a lot of times when you speak to these groups, your time is donated? That kind of frustrates me because that sounds a little exploitative to ask for donated time and then not yield a result.
You hit the nail on the head. That's exactly what it is. I've been saying that for so many years, right, Betsy? That's what I've been telling you. I've been saying that, and this is what I feel is like I feel exploited. I feel exploited.
Oh, that's really frustrating. I'm trying to think of like a good direction to go. Earlier when you were talking, I was thinking about like what the deaf theater scene looks like. Is there like a microcosm? Like I think I remember you saying something about like a school for deaf theater and whatnot. And are these like sort of sequestered spaces in which like they exist but they're separate?
Let me clarify. So there is deaf theater. There's Deaf West, which is in California, and they make great productions. There's also two shows that I can't forget. There is Big River, and there's also Spring Awakening. Those are two very famous productions within the deaf community, and they've been brought to Broadway. And then another theater that really, starting to grow now is called Austin Deaf Theater. Yes, that's right. Yes, Austin Deaf Theater. So that's starting to grow now too. And it just released a production of Cinderella, which is amazing. And it's still running up until March 5th. But wow, is all I can say about that. And it's been getting great reviews. And some of the people who are in it, I know some of them. And it's just, I've heard so many good things about that show. I mean, whether you're hearing or deaf, like it's all about access. The show itself, it's just really focusing on those deaf actors and the representation that they embody. There's also National Deaf Theater, also known as NTD, which used to be in Connecticut. And now it has shifted to Washington, D.C. And so that's where it's based now, and it's becoming much more of a professional theater organization. We do have NTD in this area, but it's more for young deaf kids. And so really those are what are available within the deaf community.
So before you were talking about expressing your wants as an individual of what you need for access, could you kind of go through what those accommodations look like for you as an individual?
Well, for sure, I want to make sure that I have an interpreter for every rehearsal. And that's not really a difficult request because, not everyone signs, right? So communication access is expected. And of course, it's hard work. So I'm already acting. So for me to be working hard to understand people and interact with people who don't sign with me it's a lot. And it becomes 3 times as much work for me. And it's exhausting. So I first of all ask for an interpreter. So that's less of that workload and I don't have to work quite as hard. I can just focus on my duties as an actor, focus on my lines and my translations and whatever I need to do to make it work. So yes, very important to have an interpreter. And then I want to make sure I have what's called a DASL, a director of artistic sign language, to make sure that my signing is clear and my sign choices are accurate and make sense for the piece. So that way, both hearing and deaf people can understand what is being said. And to make sure that hearing people know, that is people who are not deaf, it's an equivalent message that both those communities are getting. So I want that to be equitable. And I want hearing and deaf people to have access to that sign language. And then I also want to make sure that backstage I have proper lighting and make sure that communication is on point so that in my dressing room, I have a monitor so that way I can see and be ready for any cues that are coming up. And, to be getting in and out, exit and entry way, like it's not a big ask, just, visible accessibility. Do you feel like that's too much to ask, you think, Wednesday?
No, I don't think that's a long list at all. and it seems like, mostly just courtesy.
Yeah, exactly. But in the theater community, sometimes it's like, oh my God, that's so many requests. And I'm like, how? How though?
In your experience, have you noticed a pattern in the way collaborators work with you? And from that, have you developed a preference for styles of communication and artistic collaboration?
What was the last part? Which question are we on?
Oh, yeah. This is on the back page. It's EJA.
Okay. Huh. Well, the only collaboration is been with Betsy. With other people in the theater world, I typically just get Betsy with me first. We are like this, right? It's just the two of us. And then I'll also bring Kristen Johnson. She's also somebody I collaborate with pretty often. But yeah, it's usually the three, I think, right? Betsy, am I forgetting anyone? I think it's the three of us most of the time. And patterns that tends to happen, I don't really have some sort of specific pattern that I could point out or communication style, but just, again, it usually tends to be just me and Betsy, so we get each other.
Mm-hmm. Can I say something that I've observed about you as a performer? I think one thing that I've seen that you do, and when people embrace that process and work with you on that instead of taking it as, well, something that you do is you ask a lot of questions. And you ask questions about motivation, you ask questions about practical things, like if I'm going to move here, how am I going to get this? You ask questions about how other actors are around you on the stage so that you can have a sense of that. And when directors or people who are working with you accept those questions as a part of the process and not a criticism, then it works really well because what you're doing is you're gathering information for what you need as an actor. And some of that may be specific to you as a deaf actor, and some of it may not be. You're just an actor who asks a lot of questions. But I've also seen folks who have a hard time with that and think that you are criticizing them by asking those questions. So I could imagine that you would appreciate working with someone who embraced question asking and didn't take it as like an affront to their directing prowess or whatever.
Yes. I am the kind of person who, I don't really come with an agenda per se, like, you don't know what you're doing as a director, I'm better than you, right? I don't come guns blazing like that. I'm here to learn. I come to understand their artistic vision that they have. And, I just want to say, okay, how can I get there in that vision? And how can I fit in that picture, right? And so if I have to constantly shift myself, then that's part of ableism, because I'm trying to mesh and assimilate in there in other ways able-bodied people aren't made to. But oftentimes that is what happens, right? Because directors who are not deaf, they might be like, why are you asking all these questions? They're rude. And they're just coming with this mindset of, hey, I say do this, you just do it. Regardless of whether or not it feels wrong or right to me. But I want I think the audience can get that vibe. Like, why is that actor, something's off with that actor. It's not really about the character. I'm noticing something with the actor, right? And so that influences me when that vibe is already there from the start. And sometimes it just doesn't work out for me as a deaf or disabled person, because then the vibes are off and it just doesn't work. And sometimes in an actor, I don't want to give this character the wrong message through my character. I don't want to give the audience the wrong message, right? I'm here to make sure that the character that I'm playing is the right fit. I'm not here for that. I'm just really here to do my work. That's not why I'm here to cast, to make criticisms. I want to make sure that the character that I'm playing, that it's relatable for the audience, that it resonates and that positive vibe. And I want the folks to be like, oh yeah, great, you have a disabled actor. A lot of times, when you have a deaf or disabled character, it's seen as a negative thing because they're portrayed as weak. Oftentimes, it feels like, there's a hero aspect to it, right? So I'm here to change that narrative, and I want to show that deaf and disabled actors have humanity and to be authentic, and I want that connection to feel authentic.
Betsy, as an educator and someone who dabbles in theater of the oppressed and who speaks, about access, I was wondering if there are aspects of theater and access that you like to highlight in your own teachings that you find absent or lacking in other pedagogies.
I don't know about other pedagogies necessarily. I'm a real fly by the seat of my pants kind of educator. And it's a consistent thing that I work on. My education was traditional in the same way that a lot of people's was. I have a PhD in theater history, strong theater history, and I'm talking Western theater history. So my own education needs work also. But effectively what I try to do is provide examples and show works and possibilities for folks who are underrepresented. I mean, the kids these days, and I don't know about all kids, but the kids that I work with, they are really, really dedicated to highlighting voices of folks who have been historically silenced. And they want to see and hear about plays that have, main characters who are Black or who are, LGBTQIA plus, any representation of something that they could feel connected to as kids who are coming up in the world in a time when it's a little less taboo to be quote unquote different. So they're hungry for it, and I try to provide it as best I can. And the other part I think about education is just modeling it, whatever it is, modeling the curiosity, modeling the openness, modeling the idea that A, I don't know everything and there's no possible way, and B, sometimes I'm not the right person to be saying these things or teaching these things or an authority on these things. And so bringing folks in, like EJ has come to my classes before. I try to bring the people to the people, I guess.
Yeah. And I'm also curious about, you mentioned that these younger students are hungry to participate in this conversation. And I was wondering if you've noticed a contrast between, teaching younger kids versus teaching in other academic settings or in other artistic theater spaces. Do you find that other folks are also hungry for this, or perhaps they're a little bit more tentative because they understand it less?
Here's what I'll say, and I'm curious to hear what EJ has to say about this also. Kids who are younger, and I'm in a theater space, and I'm in a little alternative school, private school in JP. So I have a self-selecting community, but kids who are younger, middle and high school especially, are eager to form and understand their own identities. Everything that they encounter is filtered through their sort of quest to understand who they are and how they fit into the world. And so I think there's a really beautiful opportunity there to show them that not only do they fit, but that anyone who is anyone fits, because we're all humans. And they seem, because they're on that journey, they seem more open to that. Whereas older kids and older folks who are, and I don't really teach adults, but if I direct adults, seem to be less open to the possibility of internal or identity shifts at an older age. Not always, of course, but generally. EJ, what's your...
Yeah, for me, I think it really depends. So if we're talking about academics or theater, camps, so I used to be an assistant teacher, a para, with hearing kids, and they knew I was deaf. And so sometimes they would do little things to test me, right? And I was not for it. I was already calling them on it in the beginning, right from the jump. But again, they kept trying to test me. So they would start to respect me after a while because, I am deaf. And so they would try to play these things, but I just wasn't having it. But, I would give them attention And they would realize like, oh, okay, you noticed me. You took the time to notice me. And so that changed because, oh, I appreciated them, so they appreciated me back. And so, as you know, how often do you see Black, deaf, gay man being represented? Not often. And so they came to realize, like for me, like, oh, okay, that's EJ. We can't mess with him, compared to maybe someone else who might be a Black, able-bodied person, right? It's different. And so they, you know, even after I left, I'm sure they sort of remember me and remember like, oh yeah, that's EJ. Now with adults, I mean, it really all depends. Oftentimes what'll happen is they'll be like picking up some sign language, right? They'll try to converse with me. And then after the show's over, that motivation goes away. But then there'll be one or two who will actually become interpreters, which, you know, they might work behind stage, right? And providing communication access, but that's rare. And so they'll continue that journey. But oftentimes what happens is some people pick a couple signs up, you know, after the production, that's it. And they don't really keep in touch as much. So I'll see many of the times that like, even in hearing deaf interactions, right? Once the interaction's done, the contact is done. But how often do they really like keep in touch and keep that communication and relationship going? Not often. And again, I just wonder why that is. Because once that's gone, if you like, for example, if you look on Facebook and who talks the most on there, right? The hearing theater community is very lively on there and they have a lot to say. But then when it comes to deaf theater community, not quite the case. And then when you bring both of them together, you know, who's doing most of the talking? It's still the hearing people, still the able-bodied people. And they're the ones who are making all of the messages and the posts and everything. And so you can see that disparity. The communication and language, it shows itself even online. So it's interesting to observe. And, you know, we're over here like, hey, support us hearing people. Hello, from the deaf community. So sometimes it's hard to know where to stand. Because you'll say you'll support us and then it doesn't always happen. And you know, where are they? Where are they outside of the job? Where are our allies? Where do they go? Why does it have to just be about, okay, just during the show, but then after that, they vanish? And then there's an attitude shift, right? It's puzzling.
EJ, you've mentioned being tested and these forms of, you know, well, I guess. I
mean, but you know, the kids tested me because they liked me.
Okay, yeah.
They did it because they like just to see, you know, just to get a sense of my energy.
Okay, so but that's far more playful. They knew
what kind of person I was. So they called me sir. You used to call me sir. So sir EJ. So I'm like, okay. They'd be like, good morning, sir. I'm like, yeah, that's right. You better call me sir.
So aside from these very playful kids, I was wondering if you have experienced, you know, we were talking about subtle forms of gatekeeping. Have you experienced more explicit forms of gatekeeping? And have you encountered productive ways to engage or critique this in the industry?
Okay. Well, do you mind asking that question again? Because
yeah, and please let me know if I should ever be. I'm happy to rephrase these. Sometimes I get a little bit clunky with my wording. But basically, I was wondering if you've experienced gatekeeping.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that I'm understanding the interpreter clearly. So just ask again.
Yes, yeah. So I'm wondering if you've experienced gatekeeping and if you found productive ways to engage it or critique it.
Yes. Okay. So, yeah, gatekeeping. Again, it depends on who is the gatekeeper and what are they about. Who is he or she? And will they accept my criticism? Because sometimes they will be resistant to that. And so if there's resistance and they don't want to take that criticism because they feel like they know it all, I'm not even going to give them the time for that time of day. I'm not going to provide the opportunity to have that discussion. I'm not going to pull a meeting. I'm not going to hire that person. I will not invest in it. It's a goodbye for me, right? Because they're providing a barrier, and I'm not going to allow for that. I'm not going to allow them to block my platform, everything that I'm working so hard for, anything I'm dreaming and hope for. So that's my approach to gatekeeping.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So I kind of want to start going into a proactive discussion. What are some technologies or accommodations that theater groups can incorporate to become more accessible? You were talking about things like lighting backstage, having interpreters. Are there other things that theater groups could start thinking about right now?
Were you saying equipment or?
Yeah. So technology or other accommodations.
Well. Let me tell you. Okay. So, number one would be putting it in the budget and making it included in the budget. I want to see the numbers.
Mm-hmm.
Number one. I want to actually see it there, not just like, oh yeah, we're gonna do it. And I'm like, after the fact, what do you want to do about it? What about that grant you said you were going to ask for? What did you say about this, and these other things? So no, we want to see it. Where is it in the budget included? Where is access in the budget? So I just want to emphasize that point, that budget is number one.
Absolutely.
And sometimes sometimes I've been lied to, where they will say something's included in the budget and it's not. So I want to verify that information. I would say put a deaf or disabled person in your organization. There's no excuse why you cannot hire them. Absolutely none. Because if you're worrying about, oh, this is too many accommodations to be making, well, then guess what? That's too fucking bad. Too bad. If you really want to celebrate deafness and disability, you need to bring in a voice from that community. Have them at the table, period. There is no excuse to not. Absolutely none. And if you feel like all of these barriers are in place to getting them there, then, well, too bad. And maybe they need to go back to the drawing board and see what did the arts actually mean to you, and then we can talk.
I have not been paying attention to the time, but I know that interpreting, it gets very exhausting and that there's an hour limit, I believe. So I just want to check in with timing and Julia and all of that.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I think I'm like maxing out. So
Yeah. Okay. Here, could we do maybe 2 more questions and then call it a wrap? Is that okay with you guys?
Yeah. I think 2 more questions is fine.
Thank you so much for bringing that up, Betsy.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, let me do. Okay, I got an idea. I was watching the show The Last of Us recently, and it featured a young black deaf actor. And when I was listening to the podcast afterwards, the producers were talking about how difficult it was to find this young actor. And they said that there was plenty of talent, but it was
Yeah, that's true, because I heard they were looking for 2 years, and they're asking specific age group. And I got that email that they were sending out. And I was so excited when I saw it. And I was like, oh, they need a 10-year-old. Never mind. They're looking for a younger person. I was like, darn it. I was like, oh, I got my hopes up. But then the boy got it, and I was so happy. I haven't seen the show myself, but I've heard about it. And I was hoping it was, I know someone who's a friend of that boy. So I do know who he is, but he is a good actor. But anyway, continue.
Yes, yeah. Basically, the producers were talking about how hard it was to find this actor, and that there wasn't a pipeline, and that it was a pipeline issue. Do you have any thoughts on what a sort of a better pipeline could potentially look like? I know that's sort of an odd question, but it occurred to me to ask it.
Yeah, no. It's not a weird thing to bring up. I mean, Betsy and I are aware of that pipeline issue, and we've had discussions about it. There is a guy named Charles Baldwin, who we know, and we've been talking about the pipeline that you mentioned, and it comes up often. And so it starts from college to high school, between those ages, and there's a lot of those gaps that happen. And so the talk is about needing more education. And, you know, sometimes actors will need more training, especially those who are deaf. Because most of the time, like for me, I went to BAA, Boston Arts Academy, and my education was from hearing able-bodied people. There wasn't even one teacher or who could come in who was deaf or disabled to teach me. It was just, I was learning my education from people who did not relate to me in that same way. And so that training and education is limited. And that means the opportunities are also limited. So where is our platform from the deaf and disabled community? Again, it goes back to gatekeeping, right? Who are they? Who are those gatekeepers?
Excellent. And my last question is for Betsy and EJ. I am curious about what's a show or a role that you would love to produce, act in, direct. What's a show that you really want to do in the future?
Well, Betsy and I were just talking about this. In general, if that were to happen, right? The Scottish play, you know, right? And we were just discussing about what that would look like in the deaf community. I'm like, ooh, I would love to play a role in that. Do you think I could get in that role? And Betsy's like, yeah, of course you can. And so you should go email that director and say you want to play that role. And so I told her I would want to be a witch. Because they're usually played by females. But if I were a witch, then I would be deaf, of course. And so I would shake up that role. And I mean, she was like, I don't see why not. Why not, shoot your shot?
I love that. What about you, Betsy?
I don't know. I mean, the one that popped into my head was Ubu Wa.
Sorry, what was that?
Ubu Wa, King Ubu. It's a surrealist play from the early 1900s France. That's actually an adaptation of Macbeth. But the main character, Ubu the king, is just kind of gross and corrupt and a little disgusting. And he, instead of a scepter, carries a toilet brush. So maybe that one.
Oh my God.
Oh, I'm a huge fan of the weird stuff. That's my bread and butter. Well,
Yeah.
with that, I want to go ahead and wrap up the show. And thank you guys so much for joining us in this episode. It was so fun to talk to you all. So thank you, EJ, Julia, Betsy.
Yeah, and thank you. Thank you, Julia. Thank you, Wednesday. Thank you for just setting this up and making it very accessible. Really appreciate it. And, that we're finally making it happen. So I appreciate all of it.
Absolutely. Well, with that, I'll go ahead and sign off, and you guys have a good night now. Take care.